You need to look at a topographical map of the Russian space in Europe to get an idea of what he's after. Russia's been invaded 50-odd times in its history, and all of the invasions have come through one of 9 of what I call gateway territories that link the former Soviet space to the rest of the world. The Polish Gap, the Bessarabian Gap, those are 2 of the biggest ones, and they are, unfortunately for the Ukrainians, on the far side of Ukraine from Russia. So Putin's end goal here is to plug all 9 of these gaps. Now, when the Soviet Union collapsed, the Russians went from controlling all 9 to just 1. And bit by bit, with the Kazakh conflict, with Nagorno-Karabakh, with the Georgia War, with the Crimean War, they've added bits and pieces back to plugging those gateways. And if they get Ukraine in its totality, they will have merely plugged another 2. Now, that does mean that Ukraine is not the end of the story. It's just the middle of the story. There's another war after this one. So the geography explains the why. The why now is demographics. The Russians, well, I don't know if you've ever been to Russia, the climate is awful, and it's very difficult in a modern society to function because you don't have rivers going the right directions, the winters are long and they're harsh, and so civilization in the way that we think of it is very expensive, and they don't have any natural ways to generate capital on their own. So it's always been a very brute force approach, and it took Stalin to industrialize what was then the Soviet Union. But that has a consequence. As you move people off of the farms and into cities, kids go from being free labor to just being mobile, loud, expensive pieces of furniture. And you have less of them because adults can do math. So Russia in 2 generations went from having 7 children per family to now under 2. And that was before the bottom fell out in the post-Soviet collapse. And they're now down to about 1.4. The generation that collapsed in the 1990s is now so small that when it's their turn to have kids, there's not a whole lot that can happen. So this is kind of the last year that the Russians have a large enough cadre of people in their 20s to have a draft-based military. You wait any longer than this, and the Russians are going to have difficulties patrolling their own internal territories, much less fighting off any external aggressor. So while no one's expecting a war in the short term of somebody invading Russia, the Russians know that if they don't do this now, that no matter what the power balances are in the future, they will always be on the losing side. Yeah. We basically have a hemisphere to ourselves. I mean, our best friends are the Canadians to the north. Our most integrated economy neighbor is Mexico, now our largest trading partner. Our second largest demographic partner, Russia's never been like that. Russia borders a dozen different countries, all of which have taken a crack at Russia at some point in the past. And hypersonics sound great until you realize that unless you put a nuke on the end of that, all you've done is blown up a building. And it's a very expensive way to blow up a building. So hypersonics really serve very little purpose in a conventional war. Jets do, and Russia's military reflects that. When you've got a large chunk of territory and you expect to be the defender, you have bottomless supplies of cheap disposable jets. And to this point, there's no one on their borders who can match that. But the Germans are no slacks. The Swedes always punch above their weight. The Poles have a historical grudge to bear. The Iranians and the Turks have never been Russian friends. The Chinese almost got into nuclear war with the Japanese in the past, and the Russians are still smarting over their war with Tokyo back in 1905. So from the Russian point of view, there is no horizon that is safe. And the hypersonics just aren't the weapon systems to balance that. The only reason that the Russians have done hypersonics is their logic is if it works, then we have the ability to strike the North American continent in a very short period of time. I would argue, though, that what we've seen out of the Russian systems does not look all that promising for no other reason than either the Trump or the Biden administrations hasn't pushed for a new round of nuclear arms talks. Because as soon as they started working on hypersonics, we started working on hypersonics. And that was a program here that we shelved in the 70s. So it was very easy for us to get that back up and running again, whereas they were doing it from scratch. And if something is going to change the strategic balance that extremely, and the Russians know they can't keep up in the financial fight, you know they're going to be screaming for arms control because that's the only way they can achieve parity. As a rule, in most of the nomenclature, faster than Mach 5. So the idea is they have an intercontinental launch and then they glide down and then they're following the curvature of the Earth to the point that it's very difficult to track them. And so they make the entire trip to the United States in like 30 minutes or less. You're talking about needing to fire your interceptor before you see the missile. That's the whole idea of it. Let's start with the health. The Russians, I don't want to say they're all alcoholics or anything like that, but you can buy shots of vodka in the subway to keep you warm on a winter morning from a little old lady that's just right there at the door. The idea that vodka solves all harms is definitely ingrained into the society. In a long winter, low sun climate like Russia, there are not a huge amount of vegetables and fruits in their diets, a lot of saturated fats, and a lot of heroin. In per capita terms, Russia is probably the second most addicted country in the world. And because the bottom fell out of the healthcare system post-Soviet, they also have the highest tuberculosis rates in the world. Probably 1 in 4 Russians carry the TB bacterium
Whoa.
and bacillus form. And it's not the TB that we know here in the United States. It's multi-drug resistant. So you're talking about needing 2 years of antibiotics at the cost of several $1,000s a person to get off of it. And they just don't have the income for that. HIV, they used to be one of the most infected countries in the world, and then they stopped collecting data. So we haven't had a good update on that in 15 years. But at that time, it looked like the people of reproductive age, upwards of a fifth of the population may have been exposed, but we really just don't know. Education. In the 1980s, especially after 1983, the Russians were facing a simultaneous strategic and financial crunch. And the only way they could make the strategic picture work was by having some sort of peace with the United States. They had outspent themselves for 30 years. And so they were flat broke. And because you don't just go from, that is my ideological foe, that's the country that's been threatening me with nuclear weapons for 50 years, to, yeah, we can talk now. You don't do that in a year. It took 2 premiers dying of old age before they could finally make that offer. So in the meantime, they just tried to spend their way out of their strategic imbroglio, and it didn't work. It bankrupted them. And so they had to figure out where to cut. Well, they couldn't cut the military because they weren't really ready to make peace. They couldn't cut the nuclear facilities because they weren't ready to make peace. They couldn't cut their oil and natural gas production because that was their only source of income. So they cut education. In Russia, the educational system is different from here. So here, you go to high school, you go to college, maybe you go to grad school, you enter the workforce, and you're earning money from day one, hopefully. But in Russia, there was a technical training that was done in their high schools that is not done in the United States as a rule. And then you become an apprentice. And you have an apprenticeship for 4, 5, 6 years before you go on and get your grown-up job of being an accountant or an engineer or whatever it happened to be. Well, the high school technical training collapsed around 1985. That's when all these cuts happened, just as Gorbachev was coming to power, which meant that there was no one that could be taken as an apprentice right out of high school. You would have to train them up additionally. And so the labor force got very thin, and the educational system was never repaired. And you had the post-Soviet collapse where pretty much everything was canceled. And you fast forward to now, and the youngest group of people who have had that technical training and had a good apprenticeship and actually had a real adult job, they're in their late 50s. And it's far too late at this point to regenerate that. They've tried a couple of times with hiccups here and there. It's never really stuck because it was never for more than a small subsector like software coding or a very specific group of people like friends of Putin's kids. And as long as that's been the situation, you're not getting the millions of new workers that are skilled that you need every single year. 2 million workers also moved out in the aftermath of the Soviet collapse. They were all young and they were all skilled. And we've probably had about 250,000 Russians flee so far during the Ukraine war, which again, were young and skilled.
Wow.
And they were absolutely irreplaceable. So you fast forward just a year or 3, and we're talking about the Russians having to make some very real choices about what to let drop. Oil and natural gas, food production, the military component, the strategic missile forces. They can't keep all of these things up and running. And I don't want to overanalyze this because we just don't have very good information. We're only in week 3 of the war.
Right.
There's a case to be made that their military commanders are something they decided to let drop, in which case that was probably the wrong thing at this time. But we've seen a rocky level of military coordination and logistics in the war so far. It's abysmal. It's underperformed what every analyst I have spoken with has ever guessed the Russians were capable of. We thought they learned all those lessons after the Second Chechen War, because by the end of the Second Chechen War in 2001, they weren't doing this anymore. But here we are 20 years later, and despite a couple significant international deployments, and all of a sudden it feels like we're back in 1993. The very approach to this is not a problem necessarily with logistics. It shows a level of incompetence on strategic thinking. You're talking 1,000+ vehicles in a single file line, 40 miles long. I'm sorry, that's idiotic. And here we are. So it's looking like a catastrophic failure to perform across the entire system. The Russians are going to still win despite all of this. They outnumber the Ukrainians. They've got better equipment. They've got shorter supply lines. They don't have to worry about controlling their borders in order to keep the resources coming. They can suck up a huge amount of casualties, and Russian society will not rebel. Remember, it wasn't until you had almost 1 million dead in World War I that we had any inkling of political problems back in Russia. We're nowhere close to that. And a lot of Russians agree with what Putin is doing, either for nationalist reasons or for strategic reasons. So these reports that we do see about people fleeing Russia, they are true. There are dissidents. They are not going to win. So far, all of the protests combined, still talking less than 0.1% of the population. That doesn't move the needle in a dictatorship. And so Russia's going to win this. And then they're going to have to pacify the country. And the question is, what level of internal violence and sabotage are they willing to tolerate in order to move on to the next stage of the war? And that's where things get interesting from the NATO point of view. Because if there's one thing that was coloring American decision-making on all things Russian, it's that they were maybe not a pure force, but a near pure force. And we would have to be very careful how we operated. We would have to be at the top of our game if we weren't going to have horrendous casualties. All of a sudden, that logic's gone out the window. And we now know that if American forces and Russian forces meet on the field of battle, the Russian forces will be obliterated. And if that happens, the only choice the Russians have is between a humiliating strategic withdrawal to do whatever the Americans say or up the ante with nukes. And so from the White House, from the DOD's point of view, this has gotten a lot scarier than we ever thought it would be. Because all of a sudden, if we can't keep Russia locked down in Ukraine, if we can't bleed them there till they die, if we can't make it out of their reach so that they can then go on and do the next series of targets, then there will be a direct American-Russian confrontation that we can't avoid because these are NATO allies. So the NATO strategy, the White House strategy now, is to ship every piece of military equipment that we can that doesn't require a static physical resupply or launching point like a plane. So drones are good, anti-tank missiles are good, Stingers are good. Anything like that's great. Send it all. Because as long as Russia is bogged down in a bloodbath in Ukraine, they can't go to the next step. And that's where the American troops are. We have to prevent that from happening because the Russians now appear so weak. The degree of desperation that might exist in their strategic thinking is something that we really hadn't taken into account earlier. It's the same basic concept as what's going on with the military and the economy. The last group of people who have the full suite of training were trained in the mid-1980s. In the case of the leadership specifically, we're talking about all people from the KGB. When Yuri Andropov took over in the early 1980s, it was a bit of an internal coup in that we had one faction that used to be part of the government take over the government because they thought that the previous two rulers, Khrushchev and Brezhnev, had mismanaged the system so badly that they really needed adults in the room, people who had the full picture of everything that was going on. And in a highly censored totalitarian dictatorship, that meant the intelligence services. So the KGB generated Yuri Andropov, Chernenko, and ultimately Gorbachev, all from the KGB, to run the system. Well, these people stayed in, I wouldn't even call it the background. They weren't officially in charge, but they were always large and present in the 1990s. And when Yeltsin took ill, they're the ones who took over from Yeltsin. So we had a quick revolution, lasted a few years, then Yeltsin got dropped because his health was atrocious. And the KGB's successor, the FSB, has been in charge of ever since. Now, Putin is obviously from that crowd, but so has everyone around him. Alexei Miller of Gazprom is probably the best example, but the chiefs of all of the major companies that they're called the Silivarks, the security oligarchs, that have taken over chunks of the Russian economy in large bites ever since 1999. They are all personally beholden to Putin. They are all from that inner circle, and they are all over 50. There is not a generation waiting in the wings that has been trained. Putin has been very effective at pruning any potential challengers to his rule. So he will be the last capable, competent president of the Russian Federation. He's already 70. Every once in a while, we have a faction within that group that kind of rises to prominence because they want to succeed. And as soon as Putin thinks they might get close to succeed him, he smashes them. And so right now, we haven't had anybody like that for a few years. I mean, if you look at the demographics, it is perfectly reasonable to assume that Putin was going to be the last leader of Russia anyway. So if you're just staying in power to be the person who will turn the lights off, I've heard dumber things. The best case scenario is we get something a little bit like what happened after Mao left in China, like a gang of 4 from the different factions who rules as a committee, and then one of the 4 offs the other 3, and then he's in charge. That's kind of the best case scenario now. I think it'd be more likely that Putin has so removed everyone of leadership talent that we're probably going to have more of an organizational collapse. Igor Sechin of Rosneft, that's the state oil company, is probably the most capable who's left, but everyone else of the 150 KGB members that are left so thoroughly hate him in all things that it's really doubtful that he'd be able to rally anyone to his flag. So there really is no one. We look at leadership different than the Russians do. The strong man is who rules Russia. It always has been. The terrain does not lead to regional economics that are separate. So like, here, Texas, New York, California, Florida, Minnesota, these are all discrete economic entities. And so we have a federal system where each of the states chooses their own leadership and then submits their leadership choices at a representative level to Washington. That would never work in the Russian Federation. In the Federation, you've got Moscow, you've got St. Petersburg, and then you have all these secondary cities that are dependent upon some degree of link to one of those two. And all of them have been conquered by Russia over the course of their existence. Every single one of them. Russia is not a republic. It's certainly not a democracy. It's a multi-ethnic empire. And with that sort of political and economic footing, someone's in charge. And if someone's not in charge, no one's in charge. And the future of Russia, in my opinion, is probably going towards the latter. But for now, it means that you have a strongman in the center who appoints regional strongmen like Kadyrov to look after things for him. This is not about growth. This is not about jobs. This is not about popularity. This is about control. So Chechnya is no longer functionally part of the Russian Federation from an economic point of view, but the independence push was squelched. And Kadyrov regularly participates with Moscow when it comes to security issues. Specifically, Putin relies upon the Chechens to assassinate people in Russia who he finds politically inconvenient. Ukraine's, again, this is the middle war. So, Nagorno-Karabakh, Georgia, Crimea, Kazakhstan, these are all kind of in their back pocket now. Even control of all of Ukraine doesn't solve the problem on the Western Front. They would, in addition, need Moldova, the northeastern sliver of Romania, that's part of the Bessarabian Gap. That's how the Turks have often invaded. They would also need eastern Poland right up into downtown Warsaw on the Vistula River. That's the Polish Gap. That's where the Nazis like to invade it. And then they would need Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania in totality because that's how the Swedes have gotten in the past. So you're talking about 6 more countries, 5 which are members of NATO. Obviously, that's where things get very dicey. I mean, they can probably capture Moldova in a long weekend, although looking at the military effectiveness so far, maybe I should extend that out to a month. But for the other 5, if Ukraine is able to keep the fire lit, then the Russians aren't going to have enough conventional forces to do this. And the only thing worse than having a Russia that didn't try to do this and just kind of shrivels in time would be a Russia that leapt forward, launched the war, paid all the prices for the war, and still remains strategically unmoored. So there's a point we're going to get to in a few months, probably later this year, certainly next year, where the Russians will have digested Ukraine and Moldova to their satisfaction, their plan, and then they'll have that clash with NATO. And that's when the nukes become a very real question. Think about what the Russians did in Crimea. They started moving in troops. It was apparent that the populations were Russified enough that they were not going to resist. And when talk in the West started coming around about, we're going to back dissident forces like, say, the Crimean Tatars, who are basically Turkish, the Russians snarled, well, that will mean an end to all energy exports from Russia into Europe. At which point, Angela Merkel, in one of her more ignoble moments, said, Crimea is Russia's. We will have a level of sanctions that will not approach anything that causes economic pain to either side, and we are going to call it there. That is no longer an option. So strategic weapons are now on the table for that threat. Well, German and Russian history is always about trying to find ways to work together so they don't fight, and then that not working, so then they fight.
Right.
But then that doesn't work, so they try to find ways to work together so they don't fight. This is like the 9th cycle.
Yeah.
This is the back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And that's why the countries that are between the Russians and the Germans hate history so much. Ukraine. At the start, it was a country of 45 million people. We are now down to 42.5 million people. It's the biggest movement of people ever recorded in human history.
Wow.
2.5 million people in under 3 weeks. That's just unprecedented. And we are nowhere near done because right now the fighting is only happening on less than 1/5 of Ukrainian territory.
Wow. Yeah, Ukraine is huge.
Yeah, we haven't even gotten to the part of Ukraine that before 3 weeks ago we considered the pro-Western part. As a rule, it's not perfect, but the river, the Dnieper that cuts the country roughly in half, the general understanding was if you're west of that, you're pro-Western and you consider yourself primarily Ukrainian. And if you're east of that, you're pro-Russian and you consider yourself at least a Russian speaker. What the Russians have done in the last 8 years and having this low-intensity war in Ukraine and the Donbass has changed that. And everyone in Ukraine is now broadly considering a Ukrainian. And outside of Russian TV, there's no one in Ukraine that is not resisting in some way. I mean, this is just an epic turnaround from a national identity point of view. So Russia is going to not just have to level the entire place, they're going to have to continually bomb and launch programs the length of the entire country to retain control. That's going to generate at least another 10 million refugees. And that's going to require at least a couple million Russian soldiers to occupy the place. And that's the vast bulk of the Russian military. That includes their draftees. So we're not just talking about the best Russian troops completely being locked up. We're talking about nearly all Russian troops being locked up unless the Russians issue a state of emergency and start drafting anyone under age 50, which is probably where this is going to go because the
Wow.
Russian economy is in free fall anyway. So why not? We don't know what he's going to do because he doesn't know what he's going to do because he's not getting good information. So
Ah,
people are saying that, Putin is talking to the voices in his head. There's some truth to that, but for the most part, there is a cadre. They are intelligent. It's just not a lot of people. With Xi, there's no one. So predicting what the Chinese are going to do is kind of an exercise in futility.
I see.
There's really nothing else that the Russians can give the Chinese. The Chinese have already reverse engineered all their weapons. The pipelines to China are already running at full capacity. The rail system is already running at full capacity. The only other way to get more stuff would be if you loaded at a Russian Western port, say Petersburg or Novorossiysk, which is their shallow ports, their small boats. Then somewhere at sea, you transfer the cargo from a small vessel to a larger one, sail it around Africa because you can't use Suez, all the way to China. So the cost of that, the logistics of that, getting around insurance companies and shipping companies, they'd have to charter everything themselves, insure everything themselves, and running routes that are 4 and 5 times as long as all their other supply routes are. So just the volume of stuff that you might be able to increase to Beijing is just minuscule. So all that is left from the Chinese point of view is, how long is Russia a useful distraction away from people ganging up on China? Because on day one of this war, the Chinese were really, really excited. Because like, oh my God, this is going to show just how weak the West is. This is going to show how Russia can take an entire country and walk away with everything that it had before. And that is just so false now. And the Chinese know that if they try something on Taiwan, they are far more vulnerable to the sanction packages that the United States has now led than the Russians are. Because at the end of the day, the Chinese still import roughly 80% of their energy and 80% of the inputs that allow them to feed their population. So if you do something like we've done against Russia, against China, not only does the Chinese system collapse in a matter of months, they've lost 500 million people from famine within a year. And they now know that. So the nationalist chest beating that we've been seeing more and more and more has gotten very circumspect. And they're just focusing on amplifying the Russian propaganda on Chinese news stations because they really don't know what else to do. Because they're seeing 50 years of strategic planning the Russians have torched in a month. And that's got to hurt.